The moment I heard the furious banging on our front door, I knew it was her again. "Open this door right now, or I'm calling the police," came the screeching voice of Marlene, our local HOA president and full-time tyrant. We'd only lived in this neighborhood for 6 months, but I'd already logged more hours dealing with her than I had fixing up our house. I opened the door, still in my flannel pajama pants. "What is it now, Marlene?" She jabbed a manicured finger toward our driveway. "Your wife is parked illegally. That slab of concrete is HOA property and she can't leave her cruiser there." I leaned out to look. My wife, Tegan, had just finished a 12-hour shift and was parked in our own damn driveway again. Her sheriff's vehicle had the county logo on the side, clear as day, and it wasn't blocking anything. Not the sidewalk, not the street, not even Marlene's ego. "That's our driveway," I said flatly. "We had it surveyed before we bought the place. You've seen the documents. I don't care what fake paperwork you two cooked up. That cruiser is intimidating. It makes people uncomfortable. I'm filing a complaint, and this time I'm taking legal action." I raised an eyebrow. "Legal action? Over where my wife parks after saving lives all night?" Marlene's eyes narrowed. "Don't test me, Hayden. I know the law. And I'm placing your wife under citizen's arrest for illegal use of HOA property." I blinked. "You're what?" She spun on her heel and marched down the driveway toward Tegan, who was just stepping out of her cruiser with a thermos in hand and her badge still clipped to her belt. Tegan spotted her immediately. "Marlene, you're under arrest." Marlene barked, pointing dramatically like she was in a bad action movie. "You have no right to park here, and I'm detaining you until the sheriff's department arrives." Tegan took a sip of her coffee. "I am the sheriff's department." "No, you're not," Marlene snapped. "You're just someone playing dress-up in a uniform. I've already called the sheriff's office, and when they get here, we'll see who's really in charge." I watched the ridiculous scene unfold, part stunned, part fascinated. Tegan reached into her cruiser and pulled out her ID wallet, flipping it open. "Tegan Prescott, County Sheriff. You just committed attempted unlawful detainment of a law enforcement officer. That alone could land you in a heap of trouble." Marlene blinked hard like she couldn't compute the truth staring her in the face, but she didn't back down. "No, no, no, that badge is fake. This is HOA property and I have authority here." Tegan looked at me and sighed. "Babe, get the security footage from the porch cam." "I'm gonna need this for the report." Marlene's mouth twitched. "You think you're going to intimidate me with cameras? I run this neighborhood. The bylaws say I can detain anyone damaging or misusing HOA property." Tegan stepped forward, calm and unfazed. "And the law says impersonating an officer or attempting a false arrest is a misdemeanor at minimum. Keep pushing, and you'll find out how fast HOA rules fall apart in a courtroom. That's when our neighbor misses." Jensen stepped out from across the street, holding her little terrier and shaking her head. "Marlene, for heaven's sake, that driveway belongs to them. We all saw the survey. You're making a fool of yourself again." Marlene's face twisted. "Stay out of this, Carol." Tegan turned toward me. "Honey, can you call Deputy Ruiz? I want a second unit here to document this." I nodded and pulled my phone out. Marlene's eyes darted back and forth, realizing she might have just made the biggest mistake of her HOA reign. But it was too late. She had tried to arrest the county sheriff over a driveway spot. And now, the law was officially involved. By the time Deputy Ruiz arrived, Marlene had retreated to the sidewalk but refused to leave altogether. She paced like a cornered raccoon, muttering to herself and flinching every time someone glanced in her direction. The neighborhood had started to take notice. Curtains shifted. A few garage doors lifted an inch. People were watching, but no one stepped in to defend her. Ruiz parked behind Tegan's cruiser and walked up with one hand resting near his belt. He took one look at Marlene and raised an eyebrow. "She's the one who tried to detain the sheriff?" he asked without taking his eyes off her. Tegan nodded. "Claimed the HOA gave her authority to override county jurisdiction." Ruiz let out a low whistle. "Bold." Marlene stepped forward, arms stiff at her sides. "Deputy, I demand you arrest this woman for impersonating an officer. She has no right to use intimidation tactics and park vehicles meant for official use in a residential area. That cruiser is an eyesore and a threat." Ruiz's expression didn't change. "Ma'am, that's a county-issued vehicle parked on private property. You're not qualified to determine whether someone is impersonating a deputy, and that woman is my direct superior." "You're all in on it," she hissed, voice trembling now. "This is a conspiracy to undermine HOA authority. I've seen the signs for months." "You people think the law doesn't apply to you." Tegan stepped between them. "Marlene, you crossed a line this morning. You attempted to detain a peace officer without cause. That's a serious offense. You're lucky I haven't cuffed you already." Marlene's face contorted. "I was protecting the community from intimidation. We have bylaws. I was enforcing them." Ruiz turned toward me. "You got video." I handed him the USB drive I'd already downloaded the footage onto. "From the porch cam, full audio and everything." She tried to physically prevent Tegan from entering her home. Ruiz nodded and tucked the drive into a pouch. "That's enough for a formal report. We'll submit everything to the DA's office. They'll decide whether to file charges." Marlene's mouth opened, but no words came out. Her hands clenched at her sides, trembling. Then she spun around and stormed down the sidewalk, muttering about lawsuits and emergency board meetings. Ruiz turned toward Tegan. "Want me to take a statement now or later?" "Later," she replied. "Let's get it all on paper after I've had a few hours of sleep." He gave a short nod and turned to leave, glancing back once at Marlene's retreating figure. "She's going to double down. People like that always do," and he was right. Within 24 hours, Marlene sent out a neighborhood-wide email claiming Tegan had threatened her with physical violence, and that the HOA board had voted to suspend our membership privileges. The email ended with a warning that any homeowner harboring unauthorized law enforcement vehicles would face daily fines until compliance was achieved. We weren't the only ones she targeted. 2 streets over, a retired paramedic named Glenn received a citation for unauthorized emergency vehicle paraphernalia because he kept a first aid sticker on his mailbox. A single mother down the block got fined for excessive presence of government logos after her brother visited in his fire department SUV. Marlene's war against public servants had officially begun. The next HOA board meeting was packed standing room only. I counted over 60 neighbors in that little rec center. Some brought printed copies of the email. Others just came to see how far Marlene would push things. She stood at the front, flanked by 2 board members who looked a lot less confident than usual. Her voice cracked as she launched into a speech about preserving residential aesthetics and protecting the community from intimidation by uniformed individuals. Tegan sat beside me in plain clothes, her badge nowhere in sight. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. The room did it for her. "Are you out of your mind?" yelled Glenn from the back. "I served 30 years with the paramedics. You find me for a sticker." "I didn't feel safe," Marlene said stiffly. "You don't feel safe around people who save lives," shouted another resident. "What next? You gonna fine the mailman for having a uniform?" Dozens of voices joined in. People stood up, waving letters they'd received, demanding explanations. Marlene tried to gavel the room to silence, but the plastic hammer only made things worse. "This is harassment," said a woman near the front. "You're abusing your position to attack people who make you uncomfortable." Marlene's face flushed. "I'm enforcing the bylaws. If you don't like them, then move." "Or," I said, standing up slowly, "we could vote for a recall." The room hushed. Every eye turned toward me. Marlene's mouth twitched. "That's not how this works. You can't just—" "Yes, we can," interrupted a man from the left side of the room. Section 8, Subclause 5. If 15% of homeowners sign a petition, a recall election can be forced within 30 days. Tegan leaned over and whispered, "He's good." "Who is that, Illy?" I whispered back. "Corporate attorney. Moved in last fall." She blocked his plans to build a tool shed. Marlene backed up a step. "You people are turning this into a circus." "No," said Carol, the neighbor who'd spoken up earlier that morning. "You did that when you tried to arrest a sheriff in her own driveway." The room erupted. Half a dozen people stood up and started shouting over each other. A few were already pulling out their phones. By the end of the night, Illy and I had gathered over 30 signatures. We needed fewer than 20 to trigger the recall. It was done by the next afternoon, but things didn't stop there. The county prosecutor contacted Tegan 2 days later. After reviewing the footage and her statement, they decided to file charges against Marlene for unlawful attempted detention and filing false complaints with intent to harass a public official. The sheriff's department issued her a court summons. The day she was served, she tried to claim she'd been set up. She told the local newspaper that a militant group of government sympathizers was trying to dismantle the HOA to weaken suburban control over rogue officials. When asked for comment, the paper quoted the sheriff's department saying, "We do not consider parking in one's own driveway to be an act of intimidation." Marlene's last attempt to hold power came during the recall vote. She stood outside the polling table in the lobby of the rec center, handing out flyers that read, "Don't let the badge bullies win." Someone called code enforcement. She was issued a citation for obstructing a public vote. 91% voted to remove her. The new board took over within a week. First order of business: dismiss all pending citations issued under Marlene's leadership. Second order: vote to amend the bylaws to prohibit HOA officials from interfering with law enforcement, emergency personnel, or their vehicles. I came home one evening to find a basket on our porch, homemade cookies. A note inside read, "Thank you for standing your ground, we've got your back." Tegan walked up behind me, slipping her arm around my waist. "Guess the neighborhood's finally waking up." "About time," I said, holding up one of the cookies. "These might be the first HOA-approved thing we've gotten all year." She laughed quietly, the first real laugh since the whole mess began. Across the street, Marlene's house sat dark. The for sale sign went up the next day. The morning after the recall, I opened our mailbox and found a thick manila envelope wedged between a grocery flyer and a water bill. No return address, no postage, just our last name scrawled in shaky block letters across the front. I brought it inside and tossed it on the kitchen table. Tegan, halfway through her bowl of cereal, gave it a sideways glance. "You think it's from Marlene?" "I don't think she's got the nerve to hand-deliver anything at this point," I said, tearing it open. Inside was a stack of photocopied receipts, printed emails, and a flash drive. No note, no explanation. Just one of those cheap plastic drives you get in bulk from office stores. Tegan leaned over and scanned one of the pages. "These are HOA vendor payments. Look, landscaping invoices, pool maintenance. And that's weird. Look at the amounts. $4,000 for a single tree trimming." I flipped to the next page. Same thing, a pressure washing service billed for 3 visits in the same week, all with identical dollar amounts. Tegan frowned. "That's not just excessive, that's laundering." I plugged the flash drive into my laptop and opened the first file. It was a spreadsheet, thousands of dollars funneled through 3 companies, all registered under similar addresses. Different names, sure, but the same P.O. box kept showing up over and over again. Tegan clicked her tongue. She was embezzling, no doubt about it. Think the new board knows, maybe. But if they don't, we need to bring this straight to the county auditor. That afternoon, we drove downtown and handed everything over to the office of the Inspector General. The woman at the front desk didn't blink when she saw the HOA's name. "You're the 3rd person this year to report something from that neighborhood," she said, sliding the flash drive into a padded envelope. "We'll assign an investigator. We didn't hear anything for 3 weeks." Then, on a muggy Friday morning, 2 unmarked government vehicles pulled into the neighborhood. What followed was a quiet storm. 3 investigators in suits walked door to door, clipboard in hand. They weren't loud, but their presence was impossible to ignore. People gathered on porches. whispering as the team interviewed former board members, photographed HOA records, and requested access to the community office. By the end of the day, the entire accounting system had been seized. The new board president, a middle-aged engineer named Tasha, stood outside the clubhouse with a hand over her mouth as the auditors loaded boxes into a black SUV. That night, Tegan and I sat on the porch with two of our neighbors, watching storm clouds roll in. Glenn brought over a six-pack, and Carol from across the street arrived with a stack of homemade lemon bars. "You think she knew we were onto her?" Glenn asked, popping the top off a bottle. "She didn't leave a note," I said. "But whoever dropped that envelope wanted this exposed," Carol folded her arms. "You don't think she's got someone else doing her dirty work, do you?" Tegan glanced toward Marlene's house, still dark, still unsold. "If she does, they're quiet, for now." The next morning, the news broke. Marlene had been arrested. The story hit the local paper first, then the evening news. She'd been indicted on multiple counts of fraud, misuse of HOA funds, and falsifying financial statements. Investigators estimated she'd siphoned over $70,000 in fake maintenance contracts over a 2-year period. Worse, 2 of the companies she'd paid on paper were owned by her cousin and her sister-in-law under shell LLCs. The money was never used for services. Just rerouted through those accounts and funneled back into hers. Tegan stared at the screen, shaking her head. "She was running a full-blown racket. And she tried to arrest you over a driveway," I muttered. "All that power and it still wasn't enough." The trial came quickly. Marlene's lawyer tried to argue she'd been overwhelmed, that the financials got out of control, and that she'd simply made some mistakes in record-keeping. But the evidence was ironclad. The prosecutors brought up the HOA email servers. Turns out, Marlene had deleted dozens of invoices and documents in the days leading up to the recall. What she didn't realize was that the tech contractor hired by the HOA, also fed up with her, had quietly installed a cloud backup service. Every deletion was logged. Every overwritten file was restored. Tegan and I were called in as witnesses not for the financial crimes, but for the attempted detention. The DA wanted to show a pattern of behavior: abuse of authority, harassment, and retaliatory tactics against anyone who challenged her. On the stand, Tegan was calm and deliberate. She described the morning Marlene tried to detain her, the false claims about the driveway, and the intimidation tactics used on other first responders in the neighborhood. The jury didn't take long, guilty on all counts. Marlene was sentenced to 2 years probation, 6 months of house arrest, and ordered to pay restitution to the HOA. But the real punishment came from the community itself. She wasn't just voted out. She was erased. Her name was stripped from every document. The new board put up a bulletin at the rec center, listing every bylaw she had abused and the reforms now in place to prevent it from happening again. They even opened up the book's monthly budget reports. Vendor contracts and meeting minutes were now public. But the biggest change came a month later. The board voted to adopt a new clause. Any HOA president who attempts to enforce rules against local, state, or federal officials without legal standing would be immediately suspended pending review. No more citizens' arrests. No more driveway drama. Tegan returned to her usual shifts, but things were different now. Neighbors waved when she pulled into the driveway. A few left thank-you notes tucked under her windshield wiper. One little kid down the street even drew a picture of her cruiser and left it in our mailbox with the words, "Thank you for keeping us safe." One evening, Tegan came home and found a small plaque leaning against our front steps. It read, "For standing up when it mattered most." "Your neighbors." She picked it up and ran her fingers over the engraved letters, eyes soft. "I guess we're official now," she said. "Better than official," I replied. "We're respected." Across the street, a moving truck finally pulled up to Marlene's old house. A young couple stepped out, looking excited and nervous. I crossed the street and introduced myself. "Welcome to the neighborhood," I said with a grin. You picked a great time to move in, they laughed. What's the HOA like? The man asked. I paused. Let's just say, I replied, they've learned their lesson. And for the first time since we moved in, I actually believed it. 2 months after the trial, the neighborhood felt almost functional. The new board had stabilized things, and the last of Marlene's influence had been scrubbed from every HOA policy, document, and community bulletin. People had stopped whispering about the HOA like it was a shadowy cult. Lawns looked greener, not because of stricter maintenance codes, but because people actually wanted to be here now still. Something kept tugging at me. There was one part of the whole mess that never sat right. The anonymous envelope that exposed Marlene's fraud, someone had to have access to those documents, but we never found out who. The board didn't know. The county investigator hadn't been able to trace the source, and Marlene, during her trial, claimed she had no idea how the evidence got out. Tegan noticed I kept circling back to it. One night, while we were playing cards in the garage with our next-door neighbors, she leaned over and whispered, "You're still chewing on the envelope thing, aren't you?" I nodded once. "It feels unfinished. You want to poke the hornet's nest again, just until I find out who left the lid off." The next morning, I started digging. I emailed Tasha, the new board president, and asked for a list of everyone who had access to HOA financial records before the transition. She was hesitant at first, but after I explained I wasn't looking to start anything, just wanted to understand how deep things went, she agreed to meet. We sat at the community office the following afternoon. The blinds were drawn, but the hum of the old ceiling fan filled the space. There were 4 people besides Marlene who had login access, Tasha said, sliding a list across the table. 2 resigned the week after the recall, 1 still on the board, and the 4th, well, that's where it gets weird. I scanned the list. 1 name stood out, Raymond Denton. "Didn't he do tech support for the HOA?" I asked. "He did," she replied. Marlene hired him directly. Billed him as a cybersecurity consultant, but when we took over, we found out he wasn't certified, not even close. His credentials were faked. Tegan walked in just then, her shift over early. She joined us at the table, catching the tail end of the conversation. "Faked?" she asked. "How'd you find out?" Tasha handed her a folder. We cross-checked the cert numbers with the county's IT contractor registry. None of them matched. Turns out he was using a recycled contractor ID from someone who died 3 years ago. Tegan looked up slowly. "You're saying Marlene hired a fake cybersecurity guy and gave him full access to HOA systems?" "Everything," Tasha said. "Email servers, financial software, board communications." "We think he helped her hide the embezzlement." I tapped the folder. "You think he flipped on her?" Tasha hesitated. "Possibly. But here's the thing, he disappeared. No forwarding address, no response to subpoenas. We handed everything to the county, but nothing's come of it." "They said he left the state." Tegan leaned back in her chair. "No one just vanishes without a trace." That night, I dug deeper. I ran Raymond's name through every online database I could find, property records, traffic citations, even a voter registration tool. Nothing after the recall. It was like he'd been erased. Until I checked the zoning board minutes. 3 weeks after the HOA trial ended, a property permit had been requested in a neighboring county under the name RD Enterprises. The address on the application, a warehouse that had once been used for IT recycling. The signature, a shaky scrawl that matched his old contractor application. Tegan and I drove out there the next morning. The warehouse sat on the edge of a half-developed industrial lot. We parked a block away and approached on foot. The windows were covered in blackout film, and the front entrance had a steel-reinforced gate. But on the side wall, near the loading dock, we found a keypad entry box with a small security camera perched above it. Tegan looked up at the lens and said, "Let's give him a reason to come out." She pulled out her badge, held it up to the camera, and knocked hard on the metal door. Nothing. She knocked again, this time louder. A minute passed. Then another. Just as I was about to suggest we leave, the door opened a crack. A pale, nervous face appeared behind it. Raymond. He didn't recognize me at first, but when his eyes landed on Tegan, he froze. You, he said. I didn't think they'd send. You, Tegan stepped forward. Why'd you leave the envelope? He hesitated. Because it got too big. I was in it for side cash, not prison time. You helped her bury the fraud, I said. Then you bailed when it turned criminal. She said it was just creative bookkeeping, he muttered. I didn't know she was laundering through family businesses until the subpoenas started. Tegan narrowed her eyes. You still committed a crime by helping conceal stolen funds. I know, he said quickly. That's why I gave you the files. I thought if I exposed her, it'd be enough to make it go away. You thought hiding would protect you, I said. No, Raymond replied. I thought she'd try to take me down with her. She told me if she went down, I'd be next. She wasn't bluffing. Tegan reached into her pocket, pulled out a card, and handed it to him. You need to contact the county prosecutor, cooperate fully, and they might cut a deal. He took the card with shaking hands. Back in the car, Tegan stared out the window for a long time. He's not the mastermind, she said, but he knew enough to be dangerous. 2 weeks later, Raymond surrendered to authorities. He provided login credentials, email chains, and a detailed timeline of how Marlene had directed him to alter and delete financial records. His cooperation led to a second wave of indictments, not just against Marlene's family members who ran the shell companies, but against a former board member who'd knowingly signed off on the fake invoices in exchange for kickbacks. The fallout was swift. The HOA sued all involved parties in civil court and won. The restitution funds went toward rebuilding the community pool, repaving the walking trail, and finally fixing the broken security gate that had been in the budget for over 3 years. At the annual community meeting, Tasha took the mic and said, "This neighborhood survived a storm of corruption, intimidation, and fraud. Not because of the rules, but because of the people who stood up and said enough. People clapped, not out of obligation because they meant it." Tegan was asked to join the HOA board as a non-voting advisor. She declined, but offered to help write a new code of conduct for board members. One that included transparency standards, conflict of interest clauses, and mandatory third-party audits. The new board approved it unanimously. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, Tegan and I sat on the porch drinking iced tea. The sun dipped low behind the row of trimmed hedges, casting long shadows across the lawn. You ever think about how close we got to just letting it go? She asked. Yeah, I said. But I'm glad we didn't. She leaned her head on my shoulder. It feels like home now. Across the street, the new neighbors were planting flowers. A few kids sped by on scooters, laughing. Somewhere down the block, someone was grilling. And for once, nobody cared what kind of badge you wore, just whether you showed up when it counted.